Friends, please check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us. We need to reach 1,000 subscribers to generate income and continue with the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The sentence didn't sound cruel when it was spoken. That was the strangest part. She is not blood. My father said it as if he were correcting a clerical error. No emotion, no hesitation. Just a clean statement, placed carefully in the middle of the room, like a document slid across a table. We were inside the probate office on East Alder Street. The kind of place designed to feel neutral, beige walls, framed certificates no one ever reads, a humming fluorescent light that made everything feel slightly unreal. The chairs were arranged too neatly, like discomfort was intentional. My grandmother had been declared dead less than 2 days earlier. Her name was still warm on the paperwork. Eleanor Whitman. Date of death, Thursday, 7:42 a.m. Cause, natural. I was still wearing the same coat I'd worn when I held her hand for the last time. I hadn't realized I hadn't taken it off. My body seemed to be moving on its own, performing basic functions while my mind stayed somewhere else entirely. The lawyer had just begun reading. When my name appeared, spoken clearly, without emphasis, I felt my mother shift beside my father. I noticed it because she always did that before interrupting. A small inhale. A straightening of her spine. That's when my father leaned forward. She is not blood. He smiled politely, as if apologizing for the inconvenience of my existence. My mother nodded immediately. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just confirmation. She lived with Eleanor, she added. But she wasn't family in the legal sense. The words "lived with" landed harder than I expected. As if the last 26 years could be reduced to a housing arrangement. No one looked at me. Not my parents. Not the assistant. Not even the lawyer, yet. I remember staring at the edge of the table, tracing a small chip in the wood with my eyes. I focused on it deliberately. It felt important to anchor myself to something solid. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. Because this moment wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. I had known, for a long time, that this was how they would describe me when it mattered. Not daughter. Not family. Not even responsibility. Just, not blood. People like to believe moments like this come with warning signs, raised voices, dramatic confrontations, tension thick enough to cut. But the truth is quieter. This sentence had been forming for decades. It had been said in pieces before, in subtler ways. In the way my parents introduced me to others. In the way they spoke about the future. In the way they always framed my presence as temporary, conditional, borrowed. They never said, "She belongs to us." They said, "She's staying with Eleanor." I first went to live with my grandmother when I was 4 years old. I don't remember the decision being made. I remember the result. I remember a suitcase on the floor of my parents' bedroom, blue, with one broken zipper. I remember my mother folding clothes too quickly, as if speed would make the moment easier. I remember my father standing in the doorway, checking his watch. They told me it was, for a little while. They said Grandma's house was calmer. That I'd have more space. That it would be better for everyone. They framed it as an opportunity. At 4 years old, you don't understand strategy. You understand tone. And their tone wasn't sad. It was relieved. My grandmother lived on Willow Crest Road, in a house that smelled like lemon polish and old books. 2 stories. Blue shutters. A maple tree in the front yard that dropped leaves every October, no matter how often Eleanor raked. She opened the door before we knocked. She already had a room ready. That should have told me something. My parents stayed less than an hour. They hugged me tightly, the way people do when they want to be remembered fondly. My mother kissed my forehead. My father told me to listen to grandma and behave. Neither of them cried. When the car pulled away, my grandmother didn't wave. She waited until it turned the corner, then closed the door carefully, locking it with a soft, deliberate click. That sound stayed with me for years. From the beginning, she treated my presence as permanent. Not ceremonially. Practically. She enrolled me in school using her address. She registered me with her doctor. She labeled a drawer in the bathroom with my name, written neatly in pencil. She never once said, "This is temporary." At night, she read to me until I fell asleep. Sometimes she stayed longer than necessary, sitting in the chair by my bed, knitting quietly. "You're safe here," she told me once, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders. "That's all you need to know." I didn't ask why I needed to know it. My parents visited at first. Every few weeks. Then every few months. Then only on holidays. When they did come, they behaved like guests. They complimented the house. They commented on how well I looked. They brought gifts that felt symbolic rather than personal. A stuffed animal when I was too old for one. A sweater in a size I wouldn't reach for years. Cash in an envelope, handed to me like a tip. They never asked about my routines. They asked if I was being good. Gratitude became the expectation. "You're lucky," my mother reminded me often. Not everyone has a grandmother willing to take them in. As if I were a favor. As if I were excess. My grandmother never contradicted them in front of me. But she corrected the narrative in quieter ways. She showed up to every school meeting. She sat in the front row at performances. She learned my schedules better than I did. When forms asked for parent or guardian, she never hesitated. She signed. And that, more than anything, shaped my understanding of family. By the time I was 10, I knew not to expect my parents. I stopped waiting for calls. Stopped asking when I'd see them next. Stopped imagining reunions that never came. My grandmother noticed. One evening, while we were doing homework at the dining table, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "People show you who they are by what they maintain." I didn't understand it then. I do now. As I grew older, I began to notice things adults assume children won't. I noticed that my parents spoke about my grandmother's house as if it already belonged to them. They commented on its value. On the neighborhood. On what they might change one day. They never asked how much the property taxes were. Or when the roof had last been repaired. Or how much Eleanor paid for heating every winter. They spoke about inheritance like it was gravity, inevitable, unquestionable. And slowly, subtly, I realized something else. They never included me in that future. When I turned 16, my grandmother added my name to a small checking account. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to cover groceries and utilities if something happened. She explained every bill to me. Gas. Electricity. Insurance. What came monthly? What came yearly? What increased over time? Understanding keeps you from being dependent, she said. I thought she meant on money. Later, I realized she meant on people. By 19, I was no longer just living there. I was functioning there. I drove her to appointments. I organized paperwork. I learned which documents mattered and which ones didn't. And I started to understand my position with clarity that felt almost clinical. I belonged to my grandmother. But I existed around my parents. That distinction would matter later. Which is why, sitting in that probate office years later, hearing my father say, "She is not blood," didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like consistency. The sentence wasn't cruel. It was accurate, according to them. What they didn't realize was that accuracy had already been documented. Looking back, I can see exactly when gratitude stopped being a feeling and became a tool. At first, it was subtle. Almost reasonable. My parents would visit once or twice a year, usually unannounced or with very little notice. They'd stand in my grandmother's living room, coats still on, surveying the space like inspectors. My father's eyes always went to the same places: the windows, the hardwood floors, the staircase. My mother focused on me. "You look healthy," she'd say, as if it surprised her. Then came the reminder. "You know how lucky you are, right?" It was never framed as a question. It was a condition. An expectation. A debt. Lucky to have a roof. Lucky to have stability. Lucky someone else stepped in. They never said we couldn't. They said she could. And that difference mattered. Every time they left, the house felt quieter, but also steadier. Like the air had returned to its natural pressure. My grandmother would make tea and sit across from me at the kitchen table. She never asked how I felt about them. She asked what they said. Not emotionally. Literally. What words did they use? What did they ask about? How long did they stay? At the time, I thought she was just being attentive. Maybe even protective. I didn't yet understand that she was tracking patterns. When I was 12, my parents asked my grandmother for money for the first time in front of me. They didn't ask directly. They framed it as concern. "We're just in a tight spot," my father said, leaning back in his chair. "Temporary." My grandmother nodded. Calm. Neutral. "How much?" she asked. When he named the amount, she didn't react. She stood up, walked to her desk, and pulled out her checkbook. She wrote slowly. Carefully. Before handing him the check, she reached into a drawer and took out a small notebook. She wrote the date. The amount. And my father's name. Then she handed him the check. He didn't notice the notebook. But I did. Later that night, after they left, I asked her why she wrote it down. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because people remember help differently than they remember obligation," she said. That sentence stayed with me. As I got older, the requests became more frequent. Not always for money. Sometimes for support. Sometimes for flexibility. Sometimes for silence. They asked my grandmother to co-sign. To hold documents. To just keep an eye on things. They never asked me for anything. Not advice. Not input. Not opinion. I was invisible in those transactions. But my grandmother made sure I wasn't uninformed. She began including me in conversations, not by announcing it, but by refusing to exclude me. If they spoke about finances, she didn't send me away. If they spoke about the house, she didn't lower her voice. If they spoke about the future, she didn't pretend I wasn't there. That was her way of teaching me. By the time I was 16, I understood something important. My parents didn't resent my grandmother for raising me. They resented that she had done it without needing them. They resented that I didn't orbit them. That I didn't depend on them emotionally. That my loyalty wasn't automatic. They never said this out loud. They expressed it through tone. Through impatience. Through sarcasm. Through comments disguised as jokes. "You're basically her kid now," my mother laughed once. It wasn't humor. It was accusation. When I turned 18, something shifted. Legally, I was an adult. Practically, nothing changed. I still lived in the same room. Ate at the same table. Followed the same routines. But my parents began speaking differently. They used phrases like "eventually" and "down the line." They talked about what would happen when Eleanor isn't around. They said these things casually. Carelessly. As if I wasn't sitting right there. As if the future didn't include me at all. The first real crack happened the summer I turned 19. My mother was visiting alone. My grandmother had stepped out to run errands, leaving us in the kitchen together. The silence stretched longer than usual. My mother checked her phone, then sighed. "You know," she said, not looking at me, "this situation can't go on forever." I waited. "You'll need to figure something out eventually," she continued. "You can't just stay. Stay. As if I were furniture." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then said, "Well, Eleanor won't always be here." That was the first time my mother spoke about my grandmother's death as an administrative problem. I didn't respond. Later that evening, after my mother left, I told my grandmother exactly what was said. She listened without interruption. Then she nodded once. "That's useful," she said. That was all. From that point on, things became more deliberate. My grandmother began organizing her files more frequently. She labeled folders clearly. She dated everything. She showed me where documents were kept, not as secrets, but as information. She explained how ownership worked. What a will could do, and what it couldn't. Why clarity mattered more than fairness. "Fairness is an argument," she said. "Clarity is evidence." She also began documenting interactions. Every visit from my parents went into a notebook. Date. Duration. Topics discussed. Not opinions. Not feelings. Facts. My parents sensed the shift, even if they didn't understand it. They began asking more questions. "Why are you involving her?" my father asked once, gesturing toward me. My grandmother didn't look at him when she answered. "Because she's here," she said. "And you are not." That was the first time I saw my father truly unsettled. Not angry. Uncertain. I started to understand that my position wasn't accidental. I wasn't just living with my grandmother. I was being placed. Prepared. Not for confrontation, but for continuity. My grandmother wasn't teaching me how to fight. She was teaching me how to remain standing when others tried to erase me. And slowly, I began to realize something else. My parents weren't planning to protect me. They were planning around me. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal is supposed to. It clarified. And once something is clear, it becomes manageable. There is a moment, quiet, almost clinical, when you stop expecting protection. It doesn't come with anger. It doesn't come with grief. It comes with calculation. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in a place that smelled like dust and printer toner. I was 19, sitting in a plastic chair outside a small legal office, waiting for my grandmother to finish a meeting with her lawyer. I hadn't been invited into the room. I wasn't supposed to be part of it. I was just there to drive her home. Or so I thought. The door opened earlier than expected. My grandmother stepped out, her purse tucked under her arm, her expression unreadable. The lawyer followed, still speaking. "And without formal adoption, her standing would depend entirely on your documentation," he said. He stopped when he saw me. There was a pause, brief, but noticeable. My grandmother turned to me calmly. "That's all for today," she said. "Thank you." The lawyer nodded, said goodbye, and retreated back into his office. We walked to the car in silence. I didn't ask questions. She didn't offer explanations. But something had shifted. That night, after dinner, she asked me to sit with her at the dining table. No tea. No small talk. Just paperwork. She placed a stack of documents between us. "These are copies," she said. "Not originals." She explained what each one was. The deed to the house. Past wills. Bank account summaries. Loan records. I noticed something immediately. My parents' names appeared often. Mine did not. At least, not yet. Legally, she said, choosing her words carefully, blood creates assumptions. Paper creates certainty. I asked her what that meant for me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked me a question. If something happened to me tomorrow, she said, what do you think would happen to you? I opened my mouth to respond. Then I closed it. Because the answer was suddenly obvious. I would be discussed. I would be evaluated. I would be reduced to circumstance. Not protected. Not prioritized. Managed. That was the first night I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking. About logistics. About dependency. About how easily people disappear when they are inconvenient. My grandmother didn't panic. She didn't comfort me. She adjusted. The next morning, she asked me to help her reorganize the filing cabinet in her study. It was a small room, lined with bookshelves and one heavy wooden desk. The filing cabinet had 4 drawers, all full. We worked methodically. Utilities. Medical. Property. Legal. She showed me which documents mattered most. People think wills are everything, she said. They're not. She explained trusts. Beneficiaries. Contingencies. She didn't use emotional language. She used structure. Around that time, my parents began visiting more often. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I noticed the timing. They visited after legal appointments. After medical checkups. After paperwork-heavy weeks. They asked questions disguised as concern. How was the appointment? Did the doctor say anything serious? Is everything organized properly? They didn't ask how she felt. They asked how prepared she was. And slowly, their attention shifted toward me. Not warmly. Strategically. You're an adult now, my father said one afternoon, as if that were new information. You should start thinking about independence. He said it casually, standing in my grandmother's living room, surrounded by furniture she paid for, in a house she owned outright. Independence, from what? From whom? The implication was clear. I wasn't meant to stay. Later that evening, my grandmother asked me to write something down. Not schoolwork. Not notes. She handed me a notebook, new, unmarked. From now on, she said, I want you to record every visit. Dates. Times. What was said. No interpretation, she added. Just facts. I asked her why. She looked at me steadily. Because facts don't argue, she said. They wait. That summer, my parents made their first overt suggestion. They framed it as help. You know, my mother said during dinner, it might make sense for us to manage some things. Just to reduce Eleanor's stress. My grandmother didn't look up from her plate. What things? She asked. Accounts. Documents. That sort of thing. My grandmother nodded slowly. No, she said. Just that. No explanation. No justification. My mother smiled tightly. Well, we just thought. I know what you thought, my grandmother interrupted. Her voice was calm, but firm. And the answer is still no. The room went quiet. I watched my parents carefully. They weren't angry. They were recalculating. After that, they began excluding me from conversations more aggressively. They lowered their voices. They changed subjects when I entered rooms. They spoke around me instead of to me. It was subtle, but intentional. They wanted to remind me that I wasn't central. That whatever plans they were making didn't require my consent. My grandmother countered this quietly. She addressed me directly. She asked my opinion. She kept me present. Not defensively. Deliberately. One evening, I overheard a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. My mother was speaking in the hallway, her voice low but tense. "She's not adopted," she said. "Legally, she has no claim." I stood frozen at the top of the stairs. "That's what I'm saying," she continued. "We just need to be careful." Careful. With what? With me. That was the moment the final illusion dissolved. I wasn't just unprotected. I was a variable they intended to control. When I told my grandmother what I'd heard, she didn't react emotionally. She nodded once. "Good," she said. "Good." Not because it was pleasant, but because it confirmed what she already knew. From that point on, things moved faster. Not visibly. Structurally. She scheduled additional legal meetings. She revised documents. She added clauses. She didn't tell me everything. She told me enough. "Preparation isn't panic," she said. "It's respect for reality." By the end of that year, I understood my position fully. I wasn't protected by blood. I wasn't protected by assumption. I wasn't protected by sentiment. I was protected, if at all, by foresight. And foresight was something my grandmother had in abundance. My parents, meanwhile, were relying on something else entirely. Entitlement. They believed time would solve everything. They didn't realize time was being documented. Decline doesn't always announce itself. With my grandmother, it arrived politely. Almost apologetically. It started with shorter walks. The route she used to take around the block became half a block, then just the corner. She never complained. She simply adjusted the schedule. Walks moved to earlier in the day. Errands were grouped more efficiently. She hated inefficiency. When her hands began to shake slightly, she stopped baking, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't trust herself with hot trays. She replaced baking with organizing. Sorting. Labeling. Control didn't disappear. It changed form. My parents interpreted her slowing down as an opening. They didn't say that outright, of course. They framed it as concern. "You shouldn't be doing so much," my mother said during one visit, placing a hand lightly on my grandmother's shoulder. "Let us help." Help meant access. Access to documents. Access to accounts. Access to decisions. My grandmother smiled politely. "I already have help," she said. She glanced at me briefly, not dramatically, just enough to register intention. That was the first time I realized she was no longer just preparing me. She was positioning us. The visits became more frequent. Not longer. Just more strategic. My parents started appearing after doctor's appointments, even when they hadn't been informed. They asked questions that suggested prior knowledge. What did the cardiologist say? Did they adjust the medication? Any cognitive concerns? They said these things casually, but their eyes were sharp. They weren't listening for reassurance. They were listening for weakness. After each visit, my grandmother asked me to write everything down. Exact phrasing. Who initiated which topic? Any mention of paperwork, property, or the future. The notebook filled quickly. Around this time, she made her first significant financial move. It happened quietly. She owned a small parcel of land outside town, a remnant from decades earlier, purchased cheaply, forgotten by most. It wasn't sentimental. It was strategic. One morning, she told me she needed a ride to a meeting. We didn't discuss details. At the office, she signed documents calmly. When we left, she seemed lighter. Not relieved. Focused. "The land is sold," she said as we got into the car. I asked her where the money went. "A separate account," she replied. "One your parents don't know about." She said it without accusation. Just fact. The amount was specific. Documented. Deposited. She didn't touch it afterward. Her health continued to decline, but never dramatically enough to trigger emergency intervention. That frustrated my parents. They wanted a moment. A crisis. Something they could step into. Instead, they got consistency. My grandmother attended appointments lucidly. She answered questions clearly. She refused to sign anything she hadn't reviewed at home. Doctors noted her competence. That mattered. Meanwhile, my parents grew impatient. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," my father said once, his voice tight. "These things would be simpler if you let us manage them." My grandmother didn't look up from her paperwork. "Simpler for whom?" she asked. He didn't answer. The next shift was legal. She revised her will. Again. This time, she asked me to sit in the room. Not to speak. Not to decide. To witness. The lawyer explained the changes methodically. Trust structures. Beneficiaries. Clauses designed to prevent disputes. My grandmother listened carefully. Then she added something unexpected. A handwritten letter. She wrote it herself, slowly, deliberately. It stated that she was of sound mind. That she acted without coercion. That her decisions reflected years of consideration. It was notarized. Witnessed. Filed. When we left, she didn't say much. But that night, she asked me a question. "Do you know why people contest wills?" she asked. I said no. "Because they believe ambiguity will save them," she said. "Clarity removes hope." My parents sensed something had changed. They couldn't identify what, but they felt it. They became more careful with their language. More deliberate with their visits. More selective about what they said in front of me. They tried a different approach. Charm. They complimented me. Asked about my plans. Spoke about opportunities elsewhere. "You're young," my mother said once. "You shouldn't be tied down here." Tied down. As if my life had stalled. As if this house hadn't raised me. My grandmother listened from the other room. Later, she asked me what I thought. I told her the truth. "I think they're trying to move me," I said. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "Before they move me." The documentation intensified. She updated medical directives. Assigned decision-making authority. Specified boundaries. She made copies. She told me where they were kept. "If anyone asks," she said, "you don't argue. You retrieve." I understood. One afternoon, my parents attempted their boldest move yet. They arrived together, unannounced. They sat down in the living room and spoke as if they had already agreed on everything. "We think it's time to talk about transitions," my father said. My grandmother folded her hands in her lap. "What transitions?" she asked. "Living arrangements," my mother replied quickly. "Long-term planning." My grandmother nodded slowly. "I've already planned," she said. My father frowned. "Without us?" "Yes," she answered. The silence that followed was dense. Not explosive. Uncomfortable. My parents didn't argue. They recalculated. That night, my grandmother was unusually quiet. After dinner, she asked me to sit with her. "I won't always be able to adjust," she said. "At some point, things will move on their own." I asked her if she was afraid. She shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm prepared." She looked at me steadily. "Are you?" I nodded. And for the first time, I knew it was true. By then, everything important had already been decided. My parents just didn't know it yet. They were still operating under the assumption that time belonged to them. They didn't realize time had already been filed, dated, and sealed. My grandmother died on a Thursday morning. There was nothing dramatic about it. No alarms. No rushed phone calls. Just a quiet stillness that settled into the room the way dust settles when something hasn't been touched in a long time. I was there. She had woken earlier than usual, asked for water, and held my hand longer than necessary. Her grip was weaker, but deliberate. "Remember where things are," she said. That was the last instruction she ever gave me. She passed less than an hour later, in her own bed, with the curtains half open and the maple tree visible through the window. The leaves were already starting to turn. I called the appropriate numbers. I followed the steps she had outlined years before. I retrieved documents. I didn't panic. Preparation does that. It replaces fear with sequence. My parents arrived the next day. They were louder than the house was used to. They cried openly in the living room, voices carrying through spaces that had always been quiet. They hugged neighbors they barely knew. They spoke in complete sentences about loss, about legacy, about how hard this must be. They never once asked me how I was. They didn't need to. They assumed. At the funeral, they stood close to the front, accepting condolences with practiced nods. My mother held tissues she didn't seem to use. My father spoke about memories that felt rehearsed. I stood off to the side. Not excluded. Just unnecessary. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday. My parents arrived early. They dressed formally. Sat confidently. My father crossed his legs, relaxed. My mother glanced around the room as if taking inventory. I recognized the posture. They believed they already knew the outcome. The lawyer began methodically. He read names. Dates. Clauses. When my name appeared, spoken clearly and without hesitation, my mother stiffened. My father leaned forward. "She is not blood," he said. There it was. Not shouted. Not argued. Stated. As if the sentence itself would reorganize reality. My mother nodded immediately. She was just living there. Just. The lawyer paused. That pause mattered more than the sentence. He didn't look at them right away. He looked down, adjusted a document, and then reached for a second folder. That's when the room changed. What followed wasn't emotional. It was procedural. The lawyer explained that the house had been transferred into a trust 3 years earlier. That the transfer was complete, recorded, uncontested. I was named sole beneficiary. My parents were not listed. He explained the sale of the land. The separate account. The purpose. He presented loan records, dates, amounts, unpaid balances. He explained that these had been documented as non-gift transfers. Then he explained the clause. Any attempt to contest the will would void their claim to remaining personal items. Silence filled the room. My father tried to speak. The lawyer raised a hand. "I'm not finished," he said calmly. He read my grandmother's handwritten letter aloud. Every word. Her handwriting was familiar. Steady. Certain. "I am of sound mind," the letter said. I make these decisions freely, with full understanding of their consequences. My mother's face tightened. My father stared at the table. They didn't argue blood again. They argued intent. The lawyer cited documentation. Paper remembers everything. They lost. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They lost because there was nothing left to challenge. No ambiguity. No gap. No moment of weakness to exploit. My grandmother had anticipated not just their claims, but their language. "She is not blood" had been accounted for years earlier. Outside, after the meeting, my parents didn't speak to me. They walked past without acknowledgement. I watched them leave the building, their posture different now. Smaller. Uncertain. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. I returned to the house alone. The maple tree had shed more leaves. The driveway was empty. Inside, everything was exactly where it had always been. Nothing felt newly mine. It felt continuous. That night, I opened the filing cabinet one last time. Everything was still labeled. Still dated. Still precise. I closed the drawer carefully. Some people believe justice is loud. My grandmother believed it was inevitable. She was right.